The morning of August 10, 1985, dawned like many others over Chajma Bay. This secluded inlet near Vladivostok served as a vital hub for the Soviet Pacific Fleet. The air carried the familiar scent of salt, diesel, and cold steel. It was a place of routine, of schedules, and of immense power held in check by procedure. Docked at the pier was the K-431, a nuclear-powered attack submarine. Its crew was preparing for a standard, albeit complex, operation. They were refueling the submarine's two powerful nuclear reactors. This was a task that demanded precision and adherence to strict protocols, a delicate dance with the atom that had been performed many times before. On duty that day was Viktor Kazantsov, a seasoned reactor technician. He was a man who understood the heart of the submarine. He knew its rhythms, its groans, and the specific hum of its machinery when all was well. His world was one of gauges, dials, and indicator lights. He and his comrades moved with a practiced confidence born from years of training. The K-431 was not just any submarine, it was a Project 675, known to NATO as an Echo II class vessel. These were formidable instruments of Cold War power. Displacing around 7,000 tons when surfaced, the submarine stretched over 115 meters in length. Its primary purpose was to hunt and destroy enemy aircraft carriers. It was armed with 8 massive anti-ship cruise missiles. To propel this immense machine and power its systems, the K-431 relied on 2 VMA pressurized water reactors. The reactors used highly enriched uranium fuel, producing enormous heat that made steam, which drove the turbines and propellers. The Echo II design included many safety features, at least on paper. The reactor compartment was heavily shielded with layers of steel, lead shielding added to contain radiation. Emergency cooling systems were fitted, and redundant alarms ran through the vessel to warn of rising temperatures and pressure drops. Soviet naval doctrine rested on strict operational protocols. Reactor refueling manuals were thick, step-by-step volumes. Protocols were intended as layered defenses against accidents. The timeline of the accident on August 10, 1985, began with a seemingly minor deviation from the plan. The refueling of the portside reactor was underway. A crucial step involved lifting the reactor's heavy lid. This was done using a crane from the support ship. According to the manual, a special beam, a lifting jig, was supposed to be placed across the reactor to ensure the lid was lifted perfectly straight. For reasons that would later be debated, this beam was either improperly placed or not used correctly. As the crane began to lift, the lid became skewed, jamming against the reactor vessel. This small error set in motion a rapid and violent chain of events. The control rods, which regulate the nuclear reaction, were attached to the lid. When the lid was lifted unevenly, it also pulled the control rods partially out of the reactor core. This was the equivalent of stepping on a car's accelerator. The reactor, which was supposed to be in a safe, subcritical state, suddenly began to generate power again. Heat within the reactor core surged almost instantaneously. The small amount of water remaining in the primary cooling loop flashed into high-pressure steam. A massive steam explosion erupted from the reactor compartment. It was not a nuclear detonation, but a thermal blast with incredible force. The explosion blew the 12-ton reactor lid upwards, destroying the refueling hut on deck. It tore a gaping hole in the hull and sent radioactive steam and debris high into the air. The blast instantly killed the team working directly on the refueling. The shock wave ripped through the submarine, buckling bulkheads and shattering equipment. Simultaneously, the explosion ruptured pipes and compromised watertight integrity. Cold seawater began to pour into the vessel through the hole in the hull. The seawater mixed with highly radioactive water and coolant blasted from the core, creating a toxic, deadly soup. Inside the control room, the world turned to chaos in an instant. Lights flashed erratically. Pressure and temperature gauges shot into red or dropped to zero as sensors were destroyed. There was no single clear indicator, only overwhelming evidence of system-wide failure. Training prepared them for fire, leak, or a single malfunction. Not for this. Reports were fragmented. A flash, a deafening roar, a wave of scalding steam and water. Viktor Kazantsov focused on his panel, parsing chaotic readings. Port reactor coolant pressure went to 0 in a fraction of a second. Catastrophic breach. He understood. The heart of the submarine was the source. They were in a major radiological event. In the aftermath of the explosion, an invisible and lethal enemy was unleashed. Ionizing radiation. The blast vaporized primary coolant and ejected parts of the nuclear core. A highly radioactive plume of gas and particles shot into the sky. On board the K-431, radiation near the ruptured reactor was estimated at 90,000 Roentgens per hour. For context, about 500 Roentgens over a short period is fatal to roughly half of those exposed. First responders rushed in without specialized protection, unknowingly entering lethal radiation fields. Reactor debris littered the dock. Fuel elements and graphite created deadly hotspots. Naval documents, dosimeter readings, and medical reports later painted a chilling picture. Nausea, vomiting, burns consistent with high-level exposure. The disaster was not a single error, but a cascade of systematic failures. The primary failure was human, the improper lifting of the reactor lid. The vessel could not withstand the rapid pressure spike. The blast destroyed power lines and control circuits. Emergency cooling could not be activated. With sensors vaporized, the control room was blind. The crew fought to seal compartments and control flooding and fires. In many areas it was impossible. Warped door frames and inaccessible overrides. Design interdependence meant losing power also killed communications, lighting, and automated pumps. Technology failed them. They improvised with little more than hand tools and determination. Trapped between fire and water, the inescapable compartments, rapid flooding and intense radiation created a death trap within the aft sections. Evacuation routes were narrow and vertical, through small circular hatches and steep ladders. The explosion littered tight spaces with twisted metal, broken pipes, and fallen equipment. In darkness, navigation was nearly impossible. Water made footing treacherous and hatches hard to open against pressure. It was not just water. It was a thick, oily slurry contaminated with radioactive isotopes. Aerosols were inhaled. Soaked uniforms pressed radioactive particles to skin, increasing external and internal doses. Radiation burns inflamed skin and airways, while steam scalded flesh, each breath painful. When sailors drown in radioactive coolant, water floods lungs as hypoxia sets in, while radiation sears mucous membranes and alveoli, compounding injury even in final moments. Viktor Kazantsov fought to survive. He climbed ladders slick with oil and radioactive water, lungs burning from steam-filled air. He hauled others through, driven by a primal will to live. Each space ahead was filling, forcing another desperate climb. The surface felt impossibly far. He emerged onto the deck, exhausted, soaked, heavily irradiated, but alive. They were living testimony to the horror below. Amidst overwhelming chaos, many acted with extraordinary bravery. First responders chose duty over self-preservation. Unaware of the radiation, they laid hoses and fought the fire. 10 firefighters were among the initial casualties, many dying later from acute radiation syndrome. In total, the explosion and immediate aftermath claimed 10 lives. Nearly 300 received significant doses. In the hours after, the state moved to conceal the truth. Chajma Bay was sealed, an information blackout imposed. Survivors were silenced. The incident labeled a thermal explosion, nuclear, avoided. The K-431 was towed and left as a radioactive hulk. Cleanup was clumsy and secretive. Hotspots remained. Records were classified. The legacy was twofold: lasting contamination and quiet, persistent memory. Cesium-137 and strontium-90 settled into soil and bay sediments with long half-lives. Later studies confirmed elevated radiation in soil and marine life. For survivors like Viktor, It meant chronic illness and memories of chaos, fear, and friends lost. Only after the Soviet collapse did truth surface, too late for many. Advanced technology is vulnerable to simple error, especially when secrecy multiplies harm.